Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
Would you consider bombing the country again?
Without question, absolutely.
We can fly a bunker buster bomb from Missouri to Iran, and we can destroy whatever nuclear capacity you build up.
We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing. Do you understand that?
Do you want to respond to Iran?
Well, just a small sample of the tough talk coming out of Washington after the US strikes on Iran. Donald Trump and his team's erratic and brash style of diplomacy is forcing the rest of the world to recalibrate relations with the US. Whether it's the Middle East, Ukraine, or dealing with traditional allies, some analysts say the US president's foreign policy is being driven by aggressive masculinity, a mindset that puts demands ahead of negotiations, which operates with threats and punitive action, and believes that US national interests can only be achieved through strength and domination. One of those analysts joins us now. Alice Lassman is a policy expert with a focus on gender and the global economy. Her upcoming book explores how masculinity and emotional capital are reshaping economic life. Well, welcome to DW. You wrote about this issue recently in Foreign Policy, and you talked about the Trump administration's what you called hypermasculinity. Just explain what you meant by that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on the show, Phil. So I think hypermasculinity, the way that I've tried to coin it and describe it, is more a performance of traditional masculinity. And traditional masculinity is that kind of original notion of what manhood is, what it means to be a man. And a paper in 2021 defined this traditional masculinity and its relationship with emotional processes and aggression as being a form of masculinity that involves a lack of emotional regulation, acting not necessarily through calculation, but through intuition. And in this instance, we've seen it through preemptive attacks. Rory Stewart, an ex-MP in the United Kingdom, mentioned that this was a strategy of showing how much of a tough guy he is. So I think, just to sort of summarize my point, it's more about how the performance of traditional masculinity exerts itself, not so much being traditionally masculine, but performing that so that other people can perceive you that way.
And in this context, you're talking about not only the performance, but also the execution. We're talking about how policy is delivered. And do you see this hypermasculinity as necessarily a bad thing?
It's a great question. I think maybe we should go through a couple of the examples that we've seen it act so far. So obviously, in the most recent instance we saw in Iran, a notion of sort of refusing to back down or show weakness. We saw this also play out in the short tariff war the US had with China. I think one instance that we need to be more cautious is that peace building itself and governance is something that is normally incredibly complex. And what this logic does is that it reduces the whole notion of governance and interacting with other states to winning or losing. And that might have knock-on implications in terms of how humans suffer through very real, very painful elements of war and through conflict. I think that you're absolutely right as well, Phil, in that this isn't just a vision of masculinity that is performed, it's also the very decision-making itself that is being driven by it. So General Michael Kurilla, who is the current commander of the United States Central Command, he was described recently by a former colleague of his in that he had a lethality brand, as if men themselves who present that brand traditionally are more hypermasculine, their perspectives are trusted more than whatever the alternative is.
Okay. So you've given us much to think about there. So let's pick through a couple of the points. Your examples were Iran and China. In Iran, we have both sides. We have the United States and we have Iran and we have Israel. All of them, in my assessment, would seem to conform to what you've called this hypermasculinity. In China, though, what we saw was Trump on one side, and as far as the tariffs go, Trump on one side, the rest of the world trying to be emollient, and China saying, no, we will match you where you stand. Talk us through where you see this working or not working, because many would say, well, you know, China has done quite well to stand up to a belligerent United States president who was throwing his weight around.
Yes, that is definitely true. I think maybe what's sort of more interesting about how these two nations have interacted is that this is very much different kind of diplomacy that we're seeing. And just to sort of take you roughly through the history of United States diplomacy, started with Dwight D. Eisenhower kind of setting out the US moral architecture of what was appropriate and what was not so appropriate in US foreign policy, starting with no preemptive wars was something that he came out with. And I think there's also this notion of knowing when you've done enough to deter another player or to protect your own population. I think this has become a more dominant logic in public policy. I think another element that we're seeing too, I kind of referred to this earlier, this more performative kind of diplomacy and how diplomacy itself has now evolved. And it was coined as reality TV diplomacy by Foreign Policy, and it was coined as social media diplomacy by NBC News.
Right.
And I think all of this collectively maybe appends the idea that diplomacy was never meant for public consumption. So that is something that's quite different.
In your article, you wrote, foreign policy is increasingly turning into a zero-sum contest where leaders are incentivized to perform a brand of masculinity, signaling dominance, control, strength, or risk appearing weak. So I wonder, Alice Lassman, is this an exclusively male trait, or are you seeing women on the international stage sticking their chests out as well?
Yeah. It's a great question and very hard, obviously, to discern the distinction between women performing aspects of femininity and men performing aspects of masculinity. But I think what you referred to absolutely is that what we're seeing increasingly is this trend of gender essentialism, which is basically where genders themselves are distilled to their roots, taking that kind of very essential notion of I am a man and therefore I have to act in this particular masculine way. And that often, we have seen this historically much before this current contemporary moment. We have seen this be the way that women tend to bring themselves into leadership positions, often because it's a field that is dominated by that essentialism that comes down to masculinity having to be a necessary form of leadership. What I would caveat that with is that we've seen plenty of other expressions of leadership in the past. I think of Angela Merkel, who kind of led with a sort of technocratic view of making sure it was fact-driven, not necessarily being guided by their emotions and emotional regulation, which is that form of hypermasculinity I was earlier referring to. And equally, we saw it with Mark Carney in his first meeting after his election as Canada's Prime Minister, with his first meeting with Donald Trump, where he guided himself by what's called econometrics. And so there is part of that that might not really be pertaining to this
Here's the thing, though.
hypermasculinity describes.
But you haven't quite said you think it's a bad thing, but everything you say sort of points us in the direction that you think it's a bad thing. But from their point of view, it's useful and it works. We are seeing an increasing number of these strong men getting elected, from the United States to Argentina, India, Hungary, Turkey, you name it. So it gets them elected. We see increasing numbers of polls where people say what we want is a strong leader, words which will echo through history. But what we also have is perhaps a moment in time where that's what's necessary. I can't, talking to Vladimir Putin has got no one, nowhere so far.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And I always ask this question, is sort of like strong man, but for what? What is it in particular that the electorate wants to see reflected in their leaders? And I've written a little bit about this, around this notion of how young men who are, it's been widely documented that they are disaffected. The American Men Project, for example, that was looking at young men and their approach to the Democratic Party, don't really kind of relate to themselves and see themselves represented in the Democratic Party, even though they still support progressive values. And it's often that young men and other members of the population are looking to see their emotions and their suffering reflected, not just reflected, but also felt and performed by the leader themselves. So it is very much getting them elected. When it comes to how it performs on the global stage, I mean, it's different. I think I've described that in how this is definitely an evolution of what diplomacy is. And there are elements of it that are positive. It is in real time. Trump is posting on Truth Social, which allows us as the demos to see what's happening. And therefore, in many ways, that is more democratic to sort of partake in this notion of diplomacy, which has historically been dominated by social elites.
Right.
And
a fascinating analysis, and we thank you for it. Alice Lassman, thank you.
thanks, Tom.